before there were kings who named this land, before roads connected distant cities, the Iranian plateau existed, in a quiet, unhurried stillness. Across this wide region, more than 2,500 years ago, the land stretched between mountain ranges and open plains, shaped by the long ridges of the Zagros Mountains and the dry interior plateau. These natural divisions separated communities, allowing them to develop in isolation, each adapting to its own environment over time. And as the first light of morning slowly reached the edges of stone, the air remained cool and almost perfectly still, with only faint traces of life beginning to return. The climate was demanding and often unforgiving, with long summers of heat and dryness, followed by colder seasons in the higher lands. Water was scarce in many regions, and survival depended on careful awareness of seasonal change and available resources. People did not attempt to control the land. Instead, they learned to move with it, to adjust their lives quietly to its rhythms. In these early centuries, many groups lived as semi-nomadic tribes, moving across the land with their animals in search of water and grazing ground. Over time, some began to settle in valleys where water was more reliable, forming small and scattered villages. And across the open land, these settlements appeared gently, resting between stretches of earth and wide, empty sky. There were no formal roads connecting these places, and travel depended on memory, instinct, and the ability to read the landscape. Mountains, dry riverbeds, and the position of the sun served as guides across distances that felt both physical and unfamiliar. And when someone moved beyond their known path, the world became slightly different, quietly unfamiliar in small and subtle ways. Yet, within this separation, there was a natural balance, as no central authority governed the entire region. Each community developed its own customs and ways of living, shaped by environment and shared experience. And in the long, slow afternoons, as light softened across the land, life continued, without urgency, without need for control. To the west, early influences from civilization such as Elam and Babylon began to reach the edges of this world. These influences arrived slowly, carried through trade and distant contact, bringing small changes over time. But even then, they did not reshape the land all at once. They moved quietly, like distant echoes fading into the air. At this time, there was no sense of a unified empire, no large system connecting distant regions. Life remained centered on what was immediate: family, water, animals, and the changing sky above. There were no defined borders, no complete maps, only familiar paths remembered through repeated journeys. And if you listen carefully, there is a feeling that settles gently over this land, as though something is waiting, not yet visible, but slowly approaching, waiting for paths to form, waiting for distant places to become connected, waiting for change to arrive in its own time. But for now, everything remains simple. There is only the land, the dry air moving softly across it, and the quiet light stretching toward the horizon, and the people living slowly within it all. And if you choose to remain here a little longer, you may simply listen and let the story continue at its own gentle pace, and slowly, without any clear beginning, something began to shift across the land. By the 6th century BCE, small kingdoms and tribal groups across the Iranian plateau had already begun to interact more frequently, especially in regions closer to Mesopotamia. Among these groups were the early Persians, who lived in the southern part of the plateau, in a region later known as Persis. They were not yet an empire, nor even the most powerful people of the region, but they were becoming more organized, more connected, and more aware of the world beyond their immediate surroundings. And across the dry valleys, as paths were walked again and again, something quiet began to take shape. At this time, the Persians were under the influence of the Median Empire, a larger power that controlled much of the Iranian plateau. This relationship was not always one of conflict, but rather a shifting balance of alliance and control. Living under Median authority allowed the Persians to observe systems of governance, military organization, and regional coordination. Over time, these observations would quietly shape their own development. There was no sudden transformation, no single moment where everything changed, only a gradual awareness growing beneath the surface. In the mid-6th century BCE, a leader emerged among the Persians, Cyrus, later known as Cyrus the Great. His rise marked a turning point, though at the time, it may not have felt dramatic to those living far from the centers of power. He united the Persian tribes and challenged Median rule, eventually bringing their territories under his control. This was not just a shift in leadership, but the beginning of something larger, something that would extend far beyond the plateau, and somewhere between the movement of armies and the silence of distant villages, a new order was beginning to form. Cyrus did not rule through destruction alone. Instead, he became known for allowing conquered peoples to maintain their traditions, religions, and ways of life. This approach helped stabilize newly acquired regions and reduced resistance. It was a different kind of power, one that did not erase what already existed, but allowed it to continue quietly within a broader structure. And as news traveled, slowly, across land and memory, people began to sense, not fear alone, but something more stable, more enduring. After the conquest of the Median territories, Cyrus expanded further, eventually capturing Babylon in 539 BCE, one of the most important cities of the ancient world. This event connected the Persian world with older, deeply rooted civilizations of Mesopotamia. The fall of Babylon did not come with widespread destruction. Instead, the transition of power was relatively controlled, reinforcing Cyrus's reputation as a ruler who governed with restraint. And in the distance, beyond the walls of great cities, the wind still moved across the same open land, unchanged. With each new region added, the Persian domain became more connected. What had once been scattered communities were now part of a growing network, linked by leadership, communication, and shared structure. This did not erase local identities, but it created a subtle thread that ran across the land, tying distant places together in quiet ways. And along these early paths, where footsteps had once been uncertain, movement became just a little more familiar. Yet for most people, life did not change all at once. In small villages, far from royal centers, daily routines continued much as before. Families still woke with the sun, tended to animals, and relied on the land. The idea of a vast empire existed, but it remained distant. Something heard about, rather than directly experienced. And under the same sky, with the same shifting light, life continued slowly and steadily. Over time, however, the presence of a larger system began to influence even these distant places. Trade became slightly more predictable, movement a little safer, and communication, though still slow, more reliable than before. These changes were not dramatic, but they accumulated gently, like layers of dust settling over the land, and without fully noticing it, people found themselves living within something larger than before. What had once been a quiet and scattered landscape was beginning to hold a new kind of connection. Not visible, not immediate, but present. It was not yet the vast and structured empire it would become under later rulers like Darius I, but the foundation had been laid. And across the plateau, as light moved from one horizon to another, the land itself seemed to carry this change without resistance. Perhaps it had always been this way, that change did not arrive suddenly, but unfolded, slowly, across time. And as evening approached, and the air began to cool, the same villages settled once again into stillness, unaware that they were now part of something much larger. Before anyone called this land an empire, before roads stretched across continents, there was only a vast plateau, quiet and unchanged. More than 2,500 years ago, the region we now know as Iran was part of an early world that had not yet been fully connected. The land extended across high plateaus and rugged mountains, shaped by the long ridges of the Zagros and the open, dry interior. These natural boundaries separated people into smaller groups, where each community developed slowly, guided by its own environment and memory. And in the early morning light, as the sun rose over stone and dust, there was no single place that woke all at once, only scattered signs of life, returning gently. The climate across this land was harsh and deeply influential. Summers brought long periods of heat and dryness, while winters could be cold, especially in higher regions. Water was limited, and every decision, where to live, when to move, how to survive, depended on understanding the land rather than controlling it. There was no urgency here, no attempt to reshape the world, only a quiet adjustment to heat, to wind, and to time. In these early centuries, many people lived as semi-nomadic tribes, moving with their animals across the land in search of water and grazing ground. Over time, some began to settle in valleys where water appeared more reliably, forming small and scattered villages across the plateau. And across the open land, these small settlements rested lightly, between stretches of earth and wide, empty sky. There were no constructed roads linking these places together. Travel depended on memory, instinct, and careful observation of the land itself. Mountains, dry riverbeds, and the slow movement of the sun became the only guides across long and uncertain distances. And when someone stepped beyond the place, they knew the world shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to feel unfamiliar. Yet within this separation there was a quiet balance. No single ruler governed the entire plateau, and no unified system controlled how people lived. Each community adapted in its own way, shaped by land, weather, and the knowledge passed from one generation to the next. And in the long afternoons, as light softened across the ground, life continued, slowly, without pressure, without control. To the west, distant influences from older civilizations such as Elam and Babylon began to reach the edges of this world. These contacts came slowly, through trade, through movement, through the quiet exchange of goods and ideas. But even then, nothing changed all at once. Everything moved gradually, like wind across open land. At this time, there was no sense of a vast empire, no clear borders, no complete maps, no shared identity across regions. Life remained close to what could be seen and touched: family, water, animals, and the shifting sky above. There were only familiar paths, walked again and again, until they became memory. And if you listen carefully, there's a feeling that settles over this land, something quiet, almost unspoken, as if everything is waiting for paths to become roads, waiting for distant places to draw closer, waiting for something that has not yet arrived. But for now, everything remains simple. There is only the land, the dry air moving slowly across it, and the soft light stretching toward the horizon, and the people living quietly within it all. And if you'd like to stay here a little longer, you can simply listen and let the story unfold, slowly and slowly, without any clear moment to mark it. The stillness of the land began to shift. By the 6th century BCE, the groups across the Iranian plateau were no longer entirely isolated. In regions closer to Mesopotamia, contact between communities became more frequent, carried by movement, trade, and shared necessity. Among these groups were the early Persians, living in the southern part of the plateau, in a region that would later be known as Persis. They were not yet powerful, not yet central, but they were beginning to connect, quietly, with the world beyond their valleys. At this time, much of the plateau was under the influence of the Median Empire, a larger political force that extended its reach across surrounding lands. The Persians existed within this structure, not entirely separate, but not fully dominant either. And within that balance, something was forming, not visible, but slowly taking shape. Living alongside Median authority exposed the Persians to new systems, ways of organizing people, managing land, and coordinating movement across distance. These were not lessons taught directly, but observed over time, absorbed through proximity and experience. And like water moving beneath the surface, these ideas settled quietly, shaping what would come next. In the middle of the 6th century BCE, a leader emerged, Cyrus, later remembered as Cyrus the Great. His rise did not appear sudden to those far from the centers of power, but within the Persian world it marked the beginning of a quiet transformation. He united the Persian tribes and turned their attention outward toward a larger horizon. Cyrus challenged the rule of the Medes and eventually brought their territories under his control. This was not only a political change, but the early formation of something broader, a structure that extended beyond a single region and across the land. As news moved slowly from one place to another, a new sense of direction began to emerge. What made Cyrus different was not only his ability to conquer, but the way he chose to rule. Rather than destroying local traditions, he allowed conquered peoples to maintain their customs, beliefs, and daily ways of living. This approach created stability, not through force alone, but through quiet acceptance. And as word traveled, carried across distance and memory, people began to feel something unfamiliar, not only fear, but a sense of order, steady and lasting. In 539 BCE, Cyrus entered the city of Babylon, one of the most significant centers of the ancient world. The transition of power was relatively controlled, and the city continued to function without widespread destruction. This moment connected the Persian world to older civilizations that had shaped history long before. And beyond the Great Walls, where the land stretched outward again, the wind continued, just as it always had. With each region added, the Persian domain became more connected. Paths that had once been uncertain were walked more often, and movement across distance began to feel slightly more predictable. This did not erase the differences between places, but it created something subtle, a thread, running quietly across the land. And along these paths, where footsteps once hesitated, there was now a growing sense of direction, yet for most people life remained largely unchanged. In distant villages, far from centers of power, daily routines continued as they always had, waking with the light, tending animals, and relying on the land. The idea of something larger existed, but it remained far away, almost like a story, carried from place to place, and under the same sky, with the same shifting light, life continued, steady and familiar. Over time, however, the presence of a wider system began to settle into the background of everyday life. Trade became slightly safer, movement a little more certain, and communication, though still slow, more consistent than before. These changes were not immediate, but they accumulated quietly, like dust carried across the plateau, and without fully noticing it, people found themselves living within something larger. What had once been a scattered landscape was beginning to hold a new kind of connection, unseen, but present. It was not yet the vast empire that would later be shaped under rulers like Darius I. But the foundation had already begun, and across the land, as the light moved slowly from one horizon to another, this change continued without urgency. Perhaps it had always been this way. The transformation did not arrive all at once, but unfolded gradually across time. And as the day began to soften and the air cooled slightly, the same villages returned to stillness, unaware that they were now part of something much larger. And as this quiet transformation continued, the land did not resist it. It simply carried it forward. After the time of Cyrus, the structure of this growing Persian world began to take clearer form under his successors, especially during the reign of Darius I in the late 6th century BCE. He expanded the system that Cyrus had begun, organizing the vast territories into regions that could be governed more efficiently, later known as satrapies. This was not a sudden change, but a careful arrangement, spreading slowly across distance. With this system, communication and movement became more reliable. Roads began to take clearer shape, linking distant regions in ways that had not existed before. Messages could now travel farther, carried by riders who moved steadily across the land, connecting places that had once felt completely separate. And along these paths, where silence had once been uninterrupted, there was now a quiet sense of direction. The empire was not only expanding in size, but in structure. Systems of taxation, governance, and coordination were introduced, allowing distant regions to function within a broader whole. Yet, even within this growing structure, local traditions remained intact, continuing quietly beneath the surface of imperial order. And across the plateau, life did not suddenly change. It simply adjusted. In cities such as Susa and later Persepolis, administrative centers began to emerge, places where decisions were recorded, goods were counted, and representatives from distant lands arrived. These were places of movement and organization, yet far removed from the smaller villages scattered across the land. And beyond these centers, the same wind still moved, across fields, across stone, across open ground. For those living far from power, the empire was something distant, almost abstract. It existed in stories, in passing travelers, in small changes that were felt rather than seen. A safer path here, a new face at the edge of a village, a quiet sense that something larger was present. And yet, the rhythm of daily life remained deeply rooted in the natural world. People still woke with the light, moved with the seasons, and depended on the land for survival. The presence of an empire did not replace these rhythms. It settled around them, like a structure built gently over something older. Over time, this balance between structure and simplicity became one of the defining qualities of early Persian life. A vast system existed, but it did not erase the small details of everyday existence. It allowed them to continue within it, and as the sun moved slowly across the sky, touching mountains, fields, and distant settlements, it illuminated both the scale of the empire and the quiet lives within it. Perhaps to those living in small villages, there was no sense of history unfolding, no awareness of being part of something remembered, only the present moment, the warmth of light, the movement of air, and the familiar patterns of each day. And when evening came, as it always did, the land returned to stillness. Shadows lengthened across the ground, the heat softened, and the air grew calm once more. In that quiet space between day and night, there was no empire to see, only the land and the people within it. And it is here, in this stillness, that we begin to see more clearly, not the rise of power, but the rhythm of life itself. Because beyond the roads, beyond the rulers, and beyond the systems that slowly took shape, there were mornings, there were homes, there were simple routines, repeated again and again. And it is there, in those quiet, ordinary moments, that life in ancient Persia truly begins to unfold. And if you remain here just a little longer, you may begin to notice it. The sound of movement at dawn, the first light entering a home, the quiet beginning of another day. Morning did not begin with sound. It began with light. In the early settlements of ancient Persia, more than 2,500 years ago, a daily life followed a rhythm shaped almost entirely by the natural world. There were no clocks, no measured hours, only the gradual change of light and temperature across the land. As the first light of dawn appeared over the distant ridges of the Iranian plateau, it did not arrive suddenly. It moved slowly, touching the highest points first, then descending across the ground in a soft and steady spread. And inside small homes made of mud brick and stone, that light began to enter quietly, without interruption. Families did not wake all at once. There was no sharp beginning to the day, only a gentle transition from rest to movement. The air in the early morning remained cool, especially before the heat of the sun began to rise. This brief moment of comfort was important, and much of the day's activity was shaped around it. A person might stir slowly, adjusting to the faint glow inside the room, listening to the stillness before the day fully began. Homes in these early communities were built using materials taken directly from the surrounding land. Mud bricks, dried under the sun, formed thick walls that helped regulate temperature, keeping interiors cooler during the day and warmer at night. These structures were simple, often consisting of a few connected spaces, sometimes arranged around a small open courtyard where light and air could move more freely. And as morning light reached these spaces, it revealed textures of earth and stone, soft shadows stretching across uneven surfaces. The first movements of the day were quiet and deliberate. Someone might step outside, feeling the cool ground beneath their feet, observing the sky, and sensing the conditions of the day ahead. The position of the sun, the direction of the wind, and even the dryness of the air all provided subtle information about what the day might bring. There was no need for urgency, only awareness and a slow readiness to begin. Food preparation often started early. In many households, bread made from wheat or barley was a central part of the daily diet. Grain, which had been stored carefully, would be ground into flour and prepared for baking. This process required time and repetition, and it was often carried out as part of a shared routine within the family. And as the first fires were lit, a faint warmth spread through the space, carrying with it the soft scent of grain and heat. Children would begin to wake gradually, not to commands or structured schedules, but to the natural movement around them. They learned by watching, observing the actions of adults, understanding tasks through repetition rather than formal instruction. A child might sit quietly, watching hands move through familiar routines, learning without being told. Roles within the household were shaped by both necessity and tradition. Men often prepared for work outside, tending animals, working fields, or traveling short distances for trade or labor. Women typically managed the internal rhythms of the home, preparing food, maintaining the living space, and organizing daily needs. But these roles were not rigid in every moment. They adjusted as the day required. Outside, the land began to warm. Light spread more evenly across the plateau, and shadows shortened as the sun rose higher. The stillness of early morning gave way to gentle movement. Footsteps, voices, and the sounds of daily activity beginning to take shape. And across the village, life emerged slowly, without noise, without sudden change. Water remained one of the most important concerns. Even at the beginning of the day, attention was given to how much was available and how it would be used. In some places, water had to be carried from nearby sources, while in others, early systems like Qanat channels allowed access to underground supplies. Each drop mattered, each use was considered, and nothing was taken without awareness. As the morning continued, tasks became more defined. Animals were guided out toward grazing areas, tools were gathered, and individuals moved outward from the home into the surrounding land. Yet, even in this movement, there was no sense of haste. Everything followed a pace that matched the environment, steady, measured, and consistent. The connection between people and land was constant and immediate. There was no clear separation between daily life and the environment. It was all part of the same continuous experience. The ground underfoot, the air moving across the skin, and the light shifting overhead were not background elements. They were part of every decision, part of every action, and as the sun rose higher, bringing with it the first signs of heat, the early calm of morning began to fade. But it never disappeared completely. It remained, somewhere beneath the surface, carried quietly through the rest of the day. And in those early hours, before the world became fully awake, life in ancient Persia moved gently into another day. By the time the sun had fully risen, the village was no longer still, but it was never loud. As the morning moved forward, daily work began to take clearer form across early Persian settlements. These communities, scattered across the Iranian plateau, depended largely on agriculture, animal care, and small-scale craft. The structure of the day was not imposed by rules or schedules, but by the movement of light, the rising heat, and the needs of the land itself. And as the air began to warm, people stepped further into the day, carrying with them a quiet sense of purpose. In nearby fields, men and older children worked the soil using simple tools, often made of wood and stone, sometimes reinforced with metal in more developed regions. Wheat and barley were among the most common crops, planted and harvested according to seasonal patterns that had been observed over generations. And under the growing light, the ground began to release its warmth, rising slowly into the air. The work was steady, not rushed. Movements were repeated, practiced, and familiar, each action shaped by experience rather than instruction. There was little separation between labor and routine. Work was not a separate part of life, it was life, moving forward, one task at a time. Nearby, herds of animals were guided out toward grazing areas. Goats and sheep were the most common, valued for their milk, wool, and ability to survive in dry conditions. Young boys often assisted with this task, learning how to guide movement, recognize danger, and understand the land beyond the village. And across the open terrain, small groups moved slowly, leaving behind faint trails in dust and grass. In some areas, early irrigation systems, including Qanat channels, allowed water to reach otherwise dry land. These underground systems brought cool water from distant sources, supporting agriculture in places where rainfall alone was not enough. Maintaining these systems required shared effort. Communities worked together to keep them functional, ensuring that water continued to flow. And beneath the surface, water moved quietly, unseen, but essential. Closer to the center of the settlement, other forms of work continued. Women often remained near the home, preparing food, weaving textiles, or shaping clay into simple vessels. These tasks required patience and repetition, often carried out in shaded areas where the heat was less intense. And within these spaces, hands moved steadily, creating what was needed, day after day. Textile production was especially important. Wool from sheep was cleaned, spun, and woven into fabric used for clothing and coverings. The process was slow and required careful attention, but it provided materials that protected against both heat and cold, and as threads were drawn together, patterns formed gradually, emerging from motion and time. In some settlements, small gatherings formed near open areas where goods could be exchanged. These were not yet large marketplaces, but early forms of what would later become bazaars. People brought what they had, grain, tools, textiles, and exchanged them through simple negotiation. There was no fixed currency in many places, only value understood through need and quiet agreement. Conversations during these exchanges were calm and measured. News traveled slowly, carried by travelers or traders who moved between regions. Stories of distant places, unfamiliar customs, or shifting powers were shared in fragments, not always complete, not always certain. And as voices rose and fell, the air carried words gently, blending them into the rhythm of the day. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became more noticeable. Shadows shortened, and activity began to slow. People adjusted naturally, seeking shade, pausing when necessary, and conserving energy for later in the day. There was no resistance to the heat, only acceptance and quiet adaptation. In these moments, time seemed to stretch. The pace of life slowed even further, and movement became more deliberate. Some might rest briefly, sitting against walls or beneath simple coverings, allowing the body to recover before continuing. And in the still air, even small movements felt softened, carried gently through space. Children continued to observe and participate where they could, learning not through instruction, but through presence. They followed routines, watched interactions, and slowly understood their place within the structure of the community. And without realizing it, they absorbed knowledge, layer by layer. The connection between people remained strong, shaped by proximity and shared responsibility. These were not large or anonymous societies, but small, interconnected groups where each person's role was visible. Trust and familiarity formed naturally over time, reinforced through repeated interaction and shared experience. And across the village, lives moved alongside one another, quietly connected. Beyond the settlement, the land stretched outward once again, dry, open, and vast. Paths extended into the distance, used by travelers, herders, and occasional merchants moving between regions. And along those paths, under the steady light of the sun, movement continued, slowly, without urgency. As the morning began to shift toward midday, the energy of the village settled into a quieter rhythm. Work did not stop, but it softened, adjusting to the growing heat and the natural limits of the body. And within this balance, between effort and rest, life continued without force. There was no clear boundary between one part of the day and the next, only a gradual transition, guided by light, by air, and by the quiet needs of the land. And as the sun reached higher into the sky, casting shorter shadows across the ground, the village remained steady, held gently within the rhythm of its own existence. As the sun reached its highest point, the land grew quieter again, not from stillness, but from the weight of heat. By midday, across the settlements of early Persia, the rhythm of activity began to slow under the intensity of the rising sun. The same light that had gently awakened the land now pressed down with steady warmth, shaping how people moved and how long they could remain outside. Work did not stop entirely, but it softened, becoming more measured, more deliberate, and more aware of the body's limits. And in the open fields, where the ground held the heat, movement became slower and more careful. The air itself seemed to change. It grew drier, heavier, carrying less movement than in the early hours of the morning. Breathing became more noticeable, and even small efforts required more energy. There was no resistance to this, no attempt to push beyond it, only a quiet understanding of when to pause. In many cases, people returned toward their homes or sought whatever shade they could find. Walls made of mud brick, thick and solid, provided protection from the direct sun, keeping interior spaces noticeably cooler. Doorways remained partially open, allowing air to pass through slowly, creating a soft circulation within enclosed spaces. And as one stepped inside, the brightness of the outside world faded, replaced by a muted, earthy calm. Inside these homes, the pace shifted again. Tasks continued, but they required less movement. Preparing food, repairing tools, weaving, or simply resting for a short while. The midday period was not only about avoiding heat, but about preserving energy for the hours that would follow. And in the dim light, with shadows resting along the walls, time seemed to stretch without urgency. Food prepared earlier in the day was often shared during this quieter period. Meals remained simple: bread, fruits such as dates or pomegranates, and occasionally dairy products from goats or sheep. Eating was not rushed, nor was it structured in strict intervals. It followed the flow of the day, fitting naturally between moments of work and rest. And as hands moved slowly, passing food from one to another, there was a quiet sense of continuity. Children, who had spent the earlier hours observing or assisting, now found moments of stillness. Some rested, while others remained close to family, listening, watching, absorbing the patterns of daily life. Learning did not stop. It simply changed form, becoming quieter, more subtle. Outside, the village seemed less active, but not empty. There were still movements. Someone crossing a narrow path, an animal shifting in the shade, a faint sound carried briefly by the dry air. And under the high sun, everything appeared slightly softened, as if the land itself was resting. In regions where water was accessible, its presence became even more noticeable during these hours. Whether drawn from wells or guided through early Qanat systems, water offered both physical relief and a momentary shift in the environment. And where it flowed, the air felt cooler, the space more alive. The body adjusted naturally to this rhythm. Effort and rest were not separated, but woven together throughout the day. There was an understanding, built through experience, that pushing too far under the heat would only make the later hours more difficult. So the pace remained balanced, never forced, always in quiet alignment with the land. As time passed, the intensity of the sun remained, but the awareness of it softened. People rested, spoke quietly, or simply remained still, allowing the body to recover in small increments. And in that stillness, there was no sense of interruption, only a continuation in a different form. Gradually, as the sun began its slow descent, subtle changes returned to the air. The heat remained, but its edge softened, and movement began to feel easier once again. This transition was not immediate, but it was felt in small, almost unnoticeable ways. Shadows began to lengthen slightly, stretching outward across the ground. Light shifted from its highest intensity to something warmer, more angled, less direct. And across the village, activity prepared to return. Not suddenly, but gradually. People stepped outside once more, rejoining the open spaces, continuing tasks that had been paused earlier in the day. Animals were gathered, tools were lifted again, and the land, still warm, became active once more. And with each movement, the rhythm of life resumed, steady and familiar. The transition from midday to afternoon was one of the most subtle yet essential parts of the day. It marked not a change in purpose, but a shift in energy, an adjustment that allowed life to continue without strain. And within that balance, between heat and relief, between stillness and motion. Life remained uninterrupted. There was no need to mark the time, no need to measure the hours, only the slow movement of light and the quiet awareness of when to begin again. And as the day continued, moving gently toward evening, the village carried forward, held within the same rhythm that had always guided it. Before water could be guided, before it could be stored or shared, it had to be found. Across much of the Iranian plateau, more than 2,500 years ago, water was never guaranteed. The land itself was dry for long stretches of the year, with rainfall that was both limited and unpredictable. In many regions, rivers did not flow continuously, and surface water could disappear entirely during the hottest months. And under the wide sky, the ground held little moisture, only dust, and the memory of rain. This scarcity shaped everything: where people settled, how long they stayed, and what they were able to grow all depended on access to water. Villages were often built near seasonal streams, underground sources, or areas where water could be reached with effort. And even then, nothing was certain. Everything depended on what could be sustained. In some places, early wells were dug to reach water beneath the surface. These required both labor and knowledge, as digging too shallow would yield nothing, and digging too deep could become dangerous or collapse entirely. The process was slow and uncertain, guided by experience passed down through generations. And as the earth was opened, layer by layer, there was always the quiet hope of finding water below. For those living in drier regions, movement remained a necessary part of survival. Groups would travel with their animals across long distances, following patterns shaped by seasons and the availability of grazing land. This way of life required constant awareness of the sky, the ground, and subtle changes in the environment. And across the open terrain, paths formed slowly, marked not by construction, but by repetition. The heat of the land made water even more valuable. Under the strong sun, any exposed moisture could evaporate quickly, leaving the ground dry once again. Even when water was found, it could not be wasted. Every use had to be considered carefully, shared among people, animals, and crops. There was no excess, no room for carelessness, only a steady understanding of limitation. Agriculture, though possible, was deeply dependent on these conditions. Crops, such as wheat and barley, could grow in relatively dry soil, but only if there was enough moisture at the right time. Timing became essential. Planting too early or too late could mean losing an entire season's effort. And as seeds were placed into the ground, there was no certainty, only patience and quiet expectation. In some valleys where water sources were slightly more stable, small farming communities were able to remain in one place for longer periods. These areas became centers of more consistent life, where knowledge of the land was refined over time. And within these spaces, the relationship between people and water grew deeper, more precise, more careful. But even in these more stable regions, the challenge remained. Water could not always be seen. It existed beneath the surface, hidden, moving quietly through layers of earth and stone. To reach it required more than effort. It required understanding and a different way of thinking. Over time, people began to observe patterns, how water appeared in certain places, how it moved beneath the ground, and how it could be guided without being lost. These observations did not lead to immediate solutions, but they formed the beginnings of something more advanced. And slowly, across years, ideas began to take shape. The land itself offered subtle clues. In certain areas, vegetation grew more densely, suggesting moisture below. In others, the ground felt cooler, or the air carried a faint sense of humidity, even in dry conditions. These small signs became guides, helping people locate hidden water sources beneath the surface. And in the silence of observation, knowledge grew, quietly and steadily. Communities began to understand that survival was not only about finding water, but about preserving it, keeping it from disappearing under the heat of the sun. Surface water was too vulnerable, too exposed, too easily lost. So the question became not just where water was, but how it could be protected. This shift in thinking marked an important step. It moved people from simply reacting to the environment to working with it in a more deliberate way, and though the solutions were not yet fully formed, the need was clear, and the direction had begun to emerge. Across the plateau, as wind moved lightly over dry ground, and the sun continued its steady path across the sky, people carried this understanding with them, that water was not just a resource, but the quiet center, around which all life moved, and somewhere beneath the surface, unseen and still, the answer was already there, waiting to be brought into the light. And slowly, over time, people began to understand that water did not need to be chased, it could be guided. Across the Iranian plateau, as communities continued to observe the land, a new approach began to take shape. Rather than relying only on surface water or uncertain rainfall, they turned their attention beneath the ground, where water moved quietly through layers of soil and rock. This was not a sudden discovery, but a gradual realization built from generations of careful observation and experience. And beneath the dry surface, where the sun could not reach, something constant continued to flow. This understanding led to the development of what would later be known as the Qanat system, an underground network designed to bring water from distant sources to areas where it was needed. The idea was simple in concept, yet complex in execution. Water located at higher elevations, often near mountain foothills, could be guided through gently sloping tunnels, allowing it to travel naturally downward without the need for lifting or mechanical force. And through the earth, cut slowly by human hands, a path began to form, for water to follow. The construction of a Qanat required both skill and patience. Workers would begin by identifying a reliable water source, often hidden deep underground. From there, they dug a series of vertical shafts, spaced at regular intervals, creating access points down into the earth. These shafts also allowed air to circulate and provided a way to remove soil during excavation. And as each opening appeared, dotting the surface of the land, a quiet pattern emerged across the ground. Between these vertical shafts, a horizontal tunnel was carved, connecting them into a continuous channel. The tunnel followed a gentle slope, carefully measured so that water could flow steadily without eroding the structure or stagnating along the way. Too steep, and the water would move too quickly, too shallow, and it would not flow at all. This balance required precision. There were no modern tools, no advanced measuring devices, only knowledge passed down through experience and refined through trial and error. And in the darkness below, where light did not reach, work continued, slowly and carefully. As the tunnel extended, it eventually reached the destination, fields, villages, or storage areas where water could be used and shared. The water, once hidden and inaccessible, now emerged at the surface, cool and steady, protected from evaporation by its underground path. And as it appeared, flowing gently into open space, it carried with it the quiet success of unseen effort. The Qanat system transformed life in these regions. Areas that had once been too dry to support consistent agriculture could now sustain crops more reliably. Settlements became more stable, less dependent on seasonal movement, and more connected to a fixed place. And across the land, where dryness had once limited growth, green began to appear. Slowly, but steadily. Maintaining a Qanat required ongoing cooperation. Communities worked together to keep the tunnels clear, repair damage, and ensure that water continued to flow without interruption. This was not the work of individuals, but of groups bound together by shared necessity. The presence of a functioning Qanat changed not only the physical environment, but the rhythm of daily life. Water could now be accessed more predictably, allowing for planning, for stability, and for a deeper relationship with the land. And in places where water flowed, life gathered, quietly, around it. Even the air felt different near these channels. Cooler, softer, carrying a sense of relief that contrasted with the surrounding dryness. And in the gentle sound of moving water, there was something steady, something reassuring. The knowledge required to build and maintain Qanats was highly valued. It was passed down carefully, often within specific groups who specialized in this work, ensuring that the system could continue across generations. And through time, this understanding deepened, becoming part of the land itself. From above, the presence of a Qanat could be seen only through the line of vertical shafts stretching across the terrain. Small openings, spaced evenly, marking the path of something hidden below, something essential but unseen. And beneath those openings, in the cool darkness of the earth, water continued to move, without sound, without interruption. What had once been uncertain became reliable. What had once been hidden became accessible, not through force, but through understanding. And in that quiet achievement, the land itself seemed to change, not in appearance alone, but in possibility, because now life could remain, where once it had to move. And as water flowed steadily beneath the ground, the rhythm of ancient Persia began to deepen, rooted not only in the surface of the land, but in what lay beneath it. And once the water began to flow, life began to gather, not suddenly, but slowly and with quiet certainty. With the presence of Qanat systems across parts of the Iranian plateau, communities that once moved with uncertainty could begin to settle with greater stability. Water, no longer entirely dependent on the surface or the seasons, became something that could be relied upon more consistently. This did not remove hardship, but it softened it, just enough for life to take root. Fields that had once struggled under dry conditions now showed signs of steady growth. Wheat and barley could be planted with more confidence, and small orchards began to appear in areas where water reached the surface. The land did not transform all at once, but it responded, slowly, to the presence of water. And in these cultivated spaces, green began to break through the muted tones of earth, subtle at first, but unmistakable. Farmers worked close to these water sources, guiding the flow carefully into their fields. Simple channels directed water outward, ensuring that it reached each section of cultivated land without being wasted. Every movement of water was observed, adjusted, and understood. There was no excess even now. Water remained valuable, and its use required attention and balance. Too much could damage crops, while too little could weaken them. So each field became a place of quiet calculation, guided by experience and care. Communities organized themselves around these shared resources. Access to water was not random. It followed patterns agreed upon within the group, ensuring that all could benefit while maintaining the system over time. And within this shared responsibility, relationships formed, built on cooperation and trust. The presence of reliable water changed how people thought about time and place. Instead of moving frequently, families could remain in one area longer. building stronger connections to the land and to one another. Homes became more permanent, paths more familiar, and daily routines more predictable. And with this stability, life began to layer itself, day after day, season after season. Children grew up within these environments, learning not only how to survive, but how to maintain what had been created. They observed how water was guided, how land was cared for, and how effort was shared among the community. And in these observations, knowledge continued, without interruption. Near the outlets of Qanat channels, small gathering spaces often formed. These were places where water could be accessed, where people met, and where moments of conversation naturally occurred. And around the sound of flowing water, voices remained calm, carried softly through the air. The presence of water also shaped the physical environment of these settlements. Trees could be planted, providing shade and a sense of enclosure in otherwise open spaces. Over time, these shaded areas became places of rest, where the intensity of the sun could be softened. And beneath these branches, light filtered gently, moving slowly across the ground. In some regions, these early cultivated areas would later influence the design of more structured Persian gardens. Though simple at this stage, the idea of creating controlled, balanced spaces around water had already begun to take form. And within these spaces, there was a quiet sense of order and harmony. Daily life continued to follow the natural rhythm of the day, but now it was supported by something more stable beneath it. Work, rest, and movement all adapted to this new balance between land and water. And in that balance, there was a feeling, not of control, but of alignment. Even the air near these areas carried a different quality. Cooler, slightly more humid, and softer against the skin, it offered a contrast to the surrounding dryness of the plateau. And in that subtle change, there was relief, quiet, but deeply felt. The Qanat system did more than provide water. It reshaped the relationship between people and their environment. It allowed communities to remain, to build, and to continue across generations without constant movement. And through that continuity, something deeper began to form. A sense of place. This sense of place was not defined by borders or structures, but by familiarity, by repeated experiences within the same landscape, the same fields, the same paths, the same flowing water. And over time, these became more than surroundings. They became part of memory. As the day moved forward and the light began to soften once again, activity gradually shifted back toward the home. Work slowed, tools were set aside, and attention turned inward once more. And across the settlement, movement quieted, returning gently to stillness. But now, that stillness held something new. Not uncertainty, but continuity. Because beneath the surface, water continued to flow, steady and unseen. And around it, life in ancient Persia had found a way to remain. Not everything remained in one place. Some things began to move. As settlements across ancient Persia became more stable, supported by water systems and agriculture, a quiet change began to unfold beyond the boundaries of each village. People no longer lived only within their immediate surroundings. Slowly and without urgency, movement between places began to increase. Paths that had once been used only occasionally became more familiar, traveled again and again. These early movements were not driven by expansion or ambition, but by necessity. No single settlement could produce everything it needed. Some regions had more grain, others had better access to animals, while certain areas produced tools, textiles, or crafted goods. And between these differences, a simple idea began to take shape: exchange. At first, this exchange was direct and personal. People carried what they had, small quantities of grain, woven fabric, dried fruit, or handmade tools, and offered them in return for something they lacked. There were no large markets yet, no organized systems, only quiet interactions between individuals, and along the edges of villages or in open spaces between settlements. These exchanges began to happen, slowly and without formality. Travel during this time remained careful and measured. Distances between settlements could be long, and the land itself was often dry and exposed. Journeys were planned with attention to water sources, weather, and the physical limits of both people and animals. And as travelers moved across the plateau, their pace remained steady, never rushed, never forced. The most common companions on these journeys were animals, donkeys, goats, and later camels in some regions. These animals carried goods, provided support, and allowed people to travel slightly farther than they could alone. And across the open land, small groups moved quietly, leaving only faint traces behind them. With repeated movement, certain paths began to stand out. They were not constructed roads, but routes shaped by use, natural lines across the land where travel was easier or more reliable. Over time, these paths became known, remembered, and trusted. And along these lines, distance began to feel a little less uncertain. Encounters between travelers and settlements were often calm and cautious. Visitors were received with awareness, but also with a sense of hospitality that had grown from the realities of living in a harsh environment. Offering water, food, or rest was not only kindness, it was necessity, understood by all. And in these brief moments of meeting, something more than goods was exchanged: information, stories, memory. News traveled slowly across these early networks. Stories of distant places, unfamiliar customs, and shifting leadership passed from one person to another, often changing slightly with each telling. There was no single source of truth, only fragments carried across distance. And as these fragments moved, they began to connect places in ways that were not yet visible, but deeply felt. In some locations where paths crossed more frequently, small gathering points began to form. These were not yet structured markets, but places where people knew they might encounter others, exchange goods, and share information. And over time, these places grew, not in size, but in importance. The act of trade remained simple, guided by mutual need rather than fixed value. There were no standardized prices, no universal currency, only an understanding of worth based on usefulness and scarcity. And in each exchange, balance was sought, not through calculation, but through agreement. Hands moved slowly, offering, receiving, pausing when needed. There was no urgency to complete the exchange. Time was not measured in moments, but in presence, in the shared space between people. And within that space, trust began to form, quietly, over time. As movement increased, so did familiarity between regions. People began to recognize patterns, routes, faces, types of goods, building a subtle network of connection across the land. And though this network had no formal structure, it existed, woven gently through repeated interaction. The land itself remained unchanged, dry, wide, and open, but the way people moved across it began to shift. Distance was still real, still demanding, but it was no longer entirely isolating. And across the plateau, movement continued, steady and deliberate. These early forms of trade did not yet resemble the vast systems that would come later under imperial rule. There were no long roads, no official routes, no organized caravans moving in large numbers. But the foundation had begun, quietly, without announcement. Because each step taken between settlements, each exchange made between strangers, each story carried across distance, was building something slowly and almost invisibly, a network not of stone or structure, but of movement and connection. And as the day moved forward under the steady light of the sun, these small journeys continued, linking one place to another, in ways that would one day shape an entire empire. And over time, these quiet paths became something more. As the Persian Empire expanded under rulers such as Darius I in the late 6th century BCE, the need for stronger and more reliable connections between distant regions became increasingly important. What had once been informal routes shaped by repeated travel began to evolve into more defined and organized pathways across the land. And across the wide plateau, lines of movement slowly formed, stretching farther than before. One of the most significant developments during this period was the creation of what would later be known as the Royal Road. This route extended for thousands of kilometers, linking major centers such as Susa in the east to Sardis in the west, creating a continuous path across the empire. It was not a single road in the modern sense, but a connected system, built from existing paths, refined over time. The purpose of this network was not only trade, but communication. In a land so vast, messages needed to move quickly and reliably between regions, allowing decisions, orders, and information to travel across great distances. And along this road, movement became more certain. To support this system, relay stations were established at intervals along the route. At each station, fresh horses and riders were prepared, allowing messages to be passed forward without delay. A rider would arrive, pause only briefly, then continue onward, with renewed speed. This method allowed information to travel far faster than before. What once might have taken weeks could now be carried across the empire in a matter of days. And through this steady exchange, distance began to shrink, not physically, but in experience. Travel itself became more structured. Merchants, officials, and travelers began to use these routes with greater confidence, knowing that the path ahead was known, maintained, and shared by others. And as more people moved along these roads, the land began to feel more connected. The presence of these routes also encouraged the growth of stopping points along the way. Simple rest areas, later known as caravanserai, provided shelter, water, and space for travelers to pause during long journeys. These places were not large or elaborate, but they offered something essential, a moment of rest, within movement. And within these spaces, different lives briefly crossed before continuing on. Trade also became more efficient under this system. Goods could be transported over longer distances with greater reliability, allowing regions to exchange resources more consistently. Grain, textiles, metal goods, and crafted items moved across the empire, linking distant communities in ways that had not been possible before. And along the road, these goods traveled quietly, carried step by step across the land. To support this growing system of exchange, a standardized currency was introduced during the reign of Darius I, the gold daric. This allowed transactions to become more consistent, reducing the need for direct barter and making trade easier across different regions. And with this small piece of gold, value became more clearly understood. Yet even as these systems developed, the rhythm of movement remained calm. There was no sense of rush or urgency across the land itself. Travel was still shaped by daylight, by weather, and by the physical limits of both people and animals. And under the open sky, the road stretched onward, quiet and patient. For many, the experience of travel remained long and reflective. Days passed slowly, marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the sound of footsteps or hooves, and the steady repetition of the journey. And across these distances, thoughts moved gently. carried alongside the traveler. Even within this expanding system, the land retained its presence. Mountains still stood unchanged, winds still crossed open plains, and the vastness of the plateau remained constant. The road did not replace the land. It followed it, respecting its shape and its limits. And so, while the empire became more connected, it did not feel crowded or controlled in the way one might expect. Instead, it remained open, spacious, and quietly ordered. Messages moved, goods traveled, people passed one another, and yet the silence of the land remained. Perhaps that is what made this system so effective. It did not force change. It allowed connection to grow within what already existed and across the royal road. As light shifted from morning to evening, movement continued, steady and uninterrupted, linking cities, villages, and distant horizons into something larger, yet still deeply calm. And where the roads came together, people began to gather, not in silence, but in a quieter kind of movement. As the network of travel expanded across the Persian Empire, certain places naturally became points of arrival and meeting. These were not grand cities at first, but open spaces where paths crossed, where travelers paused, and where goods could be exchanged more regularly. Over time, these gathering places grew into early forms of what would later be known as bazaars, centers of trade shaped not by design, but by repetition. And in these spaces, movement slowed, not to stop, but to meet. The structure of these early markets remained simple. There were no permanent stalls in many places, no fixed layouts, only areas where people came to trade what they carried. Goods were placed on cloth, held in hands, or kept close by until someone approached. And in the open air, under shifting light, exchange began, quietly. The items traded reflected the diversity of the empire itself. Grain from agricultural regions, wool and textiles from pastoral communities, metal tools, pottery, dried fruits, and simple crafted objects all moved through these spaces. Each item carried with it a story of where it came from, a trace of another place, another life, beyond the horizon. There was no single language spoken in these gatherings. The Persian Empire included many cultures and regions, each with its own dialect, customs, and ways of expression. Yet communication still happened, through gesture, tone, and shared understanding of need. And in the space between words, meaning formed, slowly, but clearly. The act of exchange remained calm and deliberate. There were no raised voices, no urgency to complete a transaction quickly. Value was not fixed, but negotiated through mutual agreement, shaped by context, scarcity, and trust. And as hands moved, offering, receiving, there was a rhythm, both quiet and steady. Time in these places felt different. It was not measured by how quickly something could be done, but by the presence of people, by the flow of interaction, and by the gradual unfolding of the day. And within that flow, moments extended, without pressure. Conversations moved gently between exchanges. Travelers shared what they had seen. Conditions of the road, distant settlements, changes in leadership, or stories carried from other regions. These were not formal announcements, but fragments, woven into everyday interaction. And through these fragments, a larger awareness began to form, connecting places that many would never see directly. The bazaar became more than a place of trade. It was a space of encounter, where differences met without conflict, where people observed one another, learned from one another, and carried those impressions back to their own communities. And in that shared space, the diversity of the empire remained, without tension. Even the physical environment reflected this calm interaction. Dust moved lightly underfoot, the air carried mixed scents of grain, wool, and sun-warmed earth, and the sound of voices remained low and continuous. And beneath the open sky, the space felt both active and deeply at ease. As the day progressed, the pace of the bazaar shifted naturally. Morning brought arrivals and preparation. Midday softened activity under the heat, and the later hours allowed for a gradual return to movement and exchange. Nothing was forced, nothing rushed. Everything followed the rhythm of the day itself. Children often remained close to their families, observing these interactions just as they did within the home. They watched how exchanges were made, how trust was built, and how communication happened without urgency. And in these moments, learning continued quietly and without instruction. For some, the bazaar was also a place of rest. Travelers, having moved across long distances, paused not only to trade, but to recover, to sit, to observe, and to exist briefly within a shared human space. And in that pause, the journey softened, becoming something less demanding. As goods were exchanged and conversations came to a natural end, people began to gather their belongings once more. There was no clear signal for departure, only a gradual thinning of presence as individuals returned to their paths. And across the open space, movement shifted again, from gathering back to distance. The bazaar did not remain fixed in one moment. It existed in cycles, forming, dissolving, and forming again as people returned over time. And through these cycles, connection deepened, not through structure, but through repetition. What had once been isolated settlements were now linked not only by roads, but by shared experience. Through trade, conversation, and simple presence, a sense of connection extended across the empire, subtle but enduring. And in these quiet exchanges, something larger continued to grow, unseen but undeniable. As the sun began to lower and light softened across the land, the bazaar faded gently back into stillness, leaving behind only traces of voices, of footsteps, and of connection. And along the roads once more, people continued their journeys, carrying with them not just goods, but pieces of one another's worlds, long before ideas were written clearly, before beliefs were shaped into systems. People were already watching the world. Across the lands of ancient Persia, more than 2,500 years ago, belief did not begin as something separate from daily life. It emerged quietly, shaped by observation, by experience, and by the constant presence of the natural world. The rising of the sun, the movement of the sky, and the contrast between light and darkness all carried meaning. And in those patterns something deeper was felt, not explained, but understood. Over time, these observations formed the foundation of what would later become known as Zoroastrianism, one of the earliest structured belief systems in the region. Associated with the teachings of a figure known as Zarathustra, this belief emphasized a world shaped by opposing forces, truth and falsehood, light and darkness, order and chaos. But at its core, it remained simple, a way of seeing what was already present. The concept of light held a central place within this understanding. Light was not only physical, but symbolic, representing clarity, truth, and the presence of what was right. Darkness, by contrast, was associated with confusion, disorder, and uncertainty. And each day, as light replaced darkness, this balance could be seen again and again. For those living within these early communities, belief was not distant or abstract. It existed in small choices, in daily actions, in the way one spoke, worked, and interacted with others. There was an understanding that each person contributed to the balance of the world, not through grand gestures, but through simple, repeated acts. And in that understanding, there was a quiet sense of responsibility, carried without force. Fire became one of the most visible symbols within this belief system. It represented light in its most immediate form, warm, constant, and alive. Maintaining a flame required care and attention, and it became a focal point in both domestic and communal spaces. And, in the presence of fire, light remained steady, even as the world around it changed. In early structures that would later develop into fire temples, flames were kept burning continuously, tended by individuals who ensured that they did not fade. These spaces were not places of loud ritual, but of quiet attention, and within them, the air remained still, carrying warmth and silence. Water, like fire, was also regarded with care. As a source of life, it was treated with respect, kept clean, and protected from contamination. There was an awareness that both elements, fire and water, held a kind of purity that needed to be preserved. And in their presence, people moved carefully, with intention. The teachings associated with this belief system emphasized a simple guiding principle: good thoughts, good words, and good actions. These ideas were not enforced through strict control, but encouraged through understanding and shared values. And in daily life, they appeared quietly, in small, repeated ways. Speaking truthfully, acting with fairness, and maintaining honesty became part of the social fabric. These were not extraordinary expectations, but ordinary standards, carried through generations. And in those standards, there was stability, not imposed, but accepted. The natural world continued to reinforce these ideas. The regular cycle of day and night, the shifting seasons, and the balance between growth and decay all reflected the same underlying pattern of order and contrast. And by observing these patterns, people found meaning, without needing to separate belief from life. There were no large texts for most people to study, no formal institutions guiding every action. Belief was learned through listening, through watching, and through participation in shared practices. And in that process, it became part of memory, part of identity. Even in moments of difficulty, drought, illness, or uncertainty, these beliefs provided a framework for understanding what could not be controlled. Not as a solution, but as a way to remain steady within uncertainty. And as the sun moved across the sky each day, bringing light, then shadow, and then light again, the same pattern continued, not only in the world, but within the lives of those who observed it. And in that quiet awareness, belief in ancient Persia did not stand apart. It moved alongside everything else, woven into the land, the air, and the light. And belief did not remain in thought alone. It moved into action. As the teachings associated with early Zoroastrian belief began to settle into daily life, they were expressed not through grand ceremonies, but through quiet, repeated practices. These practices were woven into ordinary routines, shaping how people spoke, how they worked, and how they interacted with the world around them. And in these small actions, belief became visible, not as something distant, but as something lived. Among those who guided these practices were individuals later known as priests or magi. They were not rulers, nor separate from society, but observers and keepers of knowledge, responsible for maintaining rituals, tending sacred spaces, and preserving the understanding of what was considered right and orderly. And in their presence, there was no sense of authority, only quiet continuity. The role of the magi was not to control belief, but to sustain it. They ensured that fire remained lit in designated spaces, that rituals were carried out with care, and that traditions were passed from one generation to the next. Their work required attention, patience, and a steady awareness of detail. Fire rituals, though simple, held deep meaning. A flame would be kept burning, protected from wind and impurity, symbolizing the constant presence of light and truth. Maintaining this flame was not dramatic. It was careful, repeated, and quiet. And in the steady glow of fire, there was a sense of something continuous, something that did not fade. Water, too, was treated with similar care. It was not only used, but respected, kept clean, preserved, and never intentionally polluted. The idea that certain elements should remain pure shaped how people approached even the most ordinary tasks. And when water was gathered or poured, it was done with awareness. Daily rituals did not interrupt life. They followed it. Before meals, during work, or at moments of reflection, small gestures and words reinforced the connection between belief and action. These were not long or complex, but brief and deeply familiar. Speaking truthfully was itself considered a form of practice. Words carried weight, and honesty was seen as a way of maintaining balance within both the individual and the wider world. And in conversation, care was taken, not to disturb that balance. Actions, too, were observed, not in a strict or punitive way, but as part of an ongoing awareness. Helping others, fulfilling responsibilities, and avoiding harm were all understood as ways of contributing to order. And in these actions, belief remained quietly present. Ritual spaces, though simple, provided moments of stillness within the movement of daily life. These were not places of large gatherings, but of quiet attention, areas where fire was maintained, where thoughts could settle, and where individuals could reconnect with what they understood to be true. And within these spaces, time seemed to slow, just enough to notice. The rhythm of these practices did not demand separation from the world. There was no need to withdraw or step away from daily responsibilities. Instead, belief moved alongside life, shaping it gently from within. And in that closeness, there was no division, only continuity. Children learned these practices not through instruction alone, but through presence. They watched how fire was tended, how water was treated, how words were chosen, and how actions carried meaning. And in those quiet observations, understanding grew without effort. Even in moments of difficulty, these rituals provided a form of steadiness. They did not remove hardship, but they offered a way to move through it with clarity and intention. And in that movement, there was calm, even within uncertainty. The Magi continued their role quietly, maintaining the thread that connected belief to daily life. They did not stand above others, but within the same rhythm, participating in the same world they helped guide. And through their presence, knowledge remained, unbroken. Across the settlements of ancient Persia, these practices spread, not through force, but through repetition. Each act, each word, each moment of care added to something larger, something steady and enduring. And as fire continued to burn and water continued to flow, belief did not need to be declared. It was already there, in everything, quietly and completely. And just as life moved quietly, so too did its ending. In the belief system that developed across ancient Persia, particularly within early Zoroastrian practice, death was not seen as an abrupt ending, but as a transition, one that required care, awareness, and respect for the natural elements. The body, once part of life, was understood to change, to no longer carry the same presence it once did. And in that change, there was no fear, only a quiet acknowledgement. One of the most important concerns surrounding death was purity. The elements of earth, fire, and water, each considered essential and sacred, were not to be polluted by decay. This understanding shaped how the dead were treated, leading to practices that differed from burial or cremation found in other cultures. And in this care, there was a sense of balance, maintained even in loss. Instead of placing the body into the ground or burning it, communities developed a method that allowed the body to return to nature without disturbing these elements. This practice took place in structures later known as dakma, or towers of silence, circular stone constructions built in open, elevated areas. And under the open sky, these spaces remained quiet and exposed. The body would be placed within the structure, where it was gradually returned to the natural cycle through exposure to sun and scavenging birds. This process, though difficult to observe directly, was not viewed with distress, but with acceptance. It was understood as part of a larger order, one that continued beyond individual life. And above these towers, the sky remained vast, unchanged, watching over what returned to it. Those who carried out these tasks did so with care and distance, following specific practices to ensure that purity was maintained. Contact with the body was limited, and rituals were performed to acknowledge the transition that had taken place. These actions were not hurried, not emotional in outward expression, but steady and deliberate. For those who remained, mourning did not take the form of loud display. Grief existed, but it was held quietly, expressed through remembrance, through presence, and through the continuation of daily life. And in that quiet, there was space for reflection. The belief in an afterlife also shaped how death was understood. It was thought that the soul would journey after death, moving toward a form of judgment based on the balance of one's thoughts, words, and actions during life. This journey was not described in detail for all, but it was understood as part of a larger path, and within that understanding, life itself carried weight, not in a heavy way, but in a steady one. The idea of responsibility did not end with death. What a person had done, how they had lived, and how they had contributed to the balance of the world continued beyond their physical presence. And in that continuation, there was a sense that nothing was entirely lost. Even the place where these towers stood became part of the landscape of memory. Often located on higher ground, away from daily activity, they remained visible from a distance, but rarely approached without purpose. And in the still air around them, there was a quiet separation between movement and rest. The natural world remained unchanged by these practices. The land continued to receive light, the air continued to move, and the cycles of day and night carried on without interruption. Death did not disrupt this rhythm, it returned to it in a different form. For those living within this system, the presence of death did not overshadow life. It existed alongside it, understood as part of the same continuous pattern. And in that understanding, there was calm, rather than fear. Children grew up aware of these practices, though not always directly involved. They learned gradually, through observation and quiet explanation, that life and death were not separate, but connected. And in that awareness, there was acceptance, formed early and gently. As time passed and generations continued, these beliefs remained consistent, carried forward through shared understanding rather than written instruction. The same practices, the same quiet rituals, repeated, without interruption. And across the land, as the sun rose and set each day, life continued, and so did its ending. Not as something sudden, but as something that returned to where it had always been. And in that return there was no final silence, only a continuation within the land, the air, and the light. Not all life remained in small villages. Some places began to rise, built not only for living, but for gathering and meaning. As the Persian Empire expanded under rulers such as Darius I and Xerxes in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, certain locations began to take on new importance. These were not random settlements, but carefully chosen centers of administration, ceremony, and coordination across a vast and diverse empire. And among them, cities like Susa and Persepolis began to take form. Susa, located between the Zagros Mountains and the lowlands of Mesopotamia, became one of the primary administrative centers of the empire. It was a place where records were kept, decisions were made, and communication from distant regions was received and organized. And within its walls, movement was constant but never hurried. Persepolis, by contrast, was not built for daily administration, but for ceremony and representation. Constructed under Darius I around 520 BCE, it stood as a symbolic center of imperial identity, where different peoples of the empire gathered, particularly during events such as Nowruz, the Persian New Year. And rising from a vast stone platform, its structures appeared, both grounded and elevated. The architecture of Persepolis reflected both order and diversity. Columns rose tall and evenly spaced, supporting large halls where delegations from across the empire would arrive, each bringing offerings from their own regions. And carved into stone, figures moved in quiet procession, frozen yet continuous. These reliefs did not depict conflict or chaos. Instead, they showed calm movement. Figures walking, carrying goods, approaching the king in a composed and orderly manner. And in these images, there was no urgency, only structure and balance. The materials used in these cities were drawn from across the empire. Stone from nearby quarries, wood from distant forests, and artisans from many regions all contributed to their construction. And in this gathering of resources, the empire itself became visible. Yet even within these grand spaces, the surrounding environment remained present. The light of the sun moved across carved surfaces. Shadows shifted along stone floors, and the open air flowed freely through large halls and courtyards. And within that openness, the structures did not close the world. They remained, connected to it. Beyond these major centers, smaller towns and settlements also reflected a growing sense of structure. Buildings became more organized, spaces more defined, and the arrangement of streets and homes began to follow patterns shaped by both function and environment. And across these places, life continued between walls and open sky. Homes in urban areas remained similar in many ways to those in villages, constructed from mud brick, designed to regulate temperature, and often centered around inner courtyards. These courtyards allowed light and air to enter, while maintaining privacy and protection from the heat. And within these enclosed spaces, the outside world softened, becoming quieter and more contained. Movement within cities differed from the open flow of rural life. Paths were more defined, spaces more shared, and interactions more frequent. Yet, even here, the pace remained measured, never rushed. Markets, administrative areas, and residential spaces existed alongside one another, forming a layered environment where different aspects of life overlapped. And, as people moved through these areas, their paths crossed, quietly, and without disruption. The scale of these cities did not overwhelm the individual experience. Even in places like Persepolis, where structures were large and carefully designed, the human presence remained central. Steps echoed lightly across stone, voices carried gently, never rising beyond the space they filled. The surrounding landscape continued to define these urban centers. Mountains remained visible in the distance, the sky stretched wide above, and the shifting light of the day shaped how these places were experienced. And in that connection, the city did not separate itself. It remained part of the land. Perhaps for those who lived within or near these cities, there was no clear sense of grandeur in the way we might imagine it today. These places were not distant monuments, but part of daily movement, part of life itself. And as the sun moved slowly across the sky, touching stone, walls, and open courtyards, the city breathed in the same rhythm as everything else. Because even here, within the centers of power, life did not become faster or louder. It remained steady and quietly ordered. And in that balance between structure and openness, the world of ancient Persia continued to take shape. And within the heat of the land, spaces began to appear where the air felt different, softer, and more still. Across parts of the Persian Empire, especially in regions shaped by dryness and heat, people began to create enclosed spaces where water, a shade, and order came together. These spaces would later be known as Persian gardens, but in their earliest forms they were simple arrangements of land designed to bring balance into a harsh environment. And within these boundaries, the land was no longer untouched. It was gently arranged. The concept behind these gardens was not excess, but harmony. Water, brought through systems such as Qanats, was directed carefully into channels that divided the space into sections. These channels allowed water to move slowly across the garden, reaching plants while also cooling the air around it. And as water flowed, its sound remained soft, steady, and continuous. Trees were planted with intention. Tall species, such as cypress, provided shade and vertical structure, while fruit-bearing trees added both nourishment and variety to the space. Their placement was not random, but measured, creating balance between light and shadow. And beneath their branches, the air felt cooler, filtered, and calm. Paths within these gardens allowed movement without disturbing the order of the space. They followed straight lines or gentle symmetry, guiding those who walked through them without confusion or distraction. There was no sense of wandering, only a quiet awareness of direction. The word that would later describe these spaces, paridaida, carried the meaning of an enclosed area, something protected and defined. Over time, this idea would influence other cultures, eventually becoming the root of the word paradise. But in its original form, it was not an abstract idea, it was a physical place, shaped by care. Light played an important role within these gardens. As the sun moved across the sky, it interacted with water, leaves, and pathways, creating shifting patterns that changed throughout the day. Nothing remained fixed, yet everything stayed in balance. In contrast to the wide openness of the surrounding land, these gardens offered a sense of contained stillness. The walls or boundaries that defined them did not isolate them completely, but softened the outside world, reducing wind, heat, and noise. And within that space, the outside faded just enough to rest. People did not enter these gardens with urgency. They moved slowly, sat in shaded areas, or paused near flowing water, allowing the environment to shape their experience. These were not places of activity, but of presence and quiet awareness. Even in larger cities such as Susa or later developments near Persepolis, gardens became part of architectural planning, integrated into the layout of buildings and open spaces. They were not separate from life, but woven into it, as a place of balance. Water remained the center of these spaces. Without it, the garden could not exist. Its movement defined the structure, its sound defined the atmosphere, and its presence defined the purpose. And as it flowed, everything around it seemed to follow. The temperature within these gardens often differed noticeably from the surrounding land. Air cooled slightly as it passed over water and through shaded areas, creating a subtle but meaningful contrast with the heat outside. And in that difference, there was relief, quiet, but constant. These spaces reflected a deeper understanding of how to live within the environment, rather than against it. They did not attempt to change the nature of the land. but to create small areas where its effects could be softened and balanced. And in that approach, there was no force, only adjustment. For those who experienced these gardens, there may not have been a sense of luxury as we might define it today. Instead, there was a feeling of calm, of stepping into a space where the intensity of the world was reduced and where attention could settle more easily. And within that calm, time moved differently, slower, and more gently. As the day moved toward evening, and the quality of light within these gardens shifted once more. Shadows lengthened, colors softened, and the sound of water remained steady as everything else began to quiet. And in that moment, the space felt complete, balanced, without effort. Perhaps this is what made these gardens endure beyond their time. Not their structure alone, but the feeling they created, one of order within openness. And even as the empire expanded, as roads stretched further and cities grew more defined, these quiet spaces remained unchanged in their purpose, to bring together water, light, and stillness into something that could be felt without needing to be explained. And beyond stone and water, there were other forms of creation, smaller, quieter, yet just as present. Across the Persian Empire, daily life was not only shaped by survival or structure, but also by a steady attention to form, texture, and detail. Clothing, tools, and crafted objects were made not only for use, but with a sense of balance and care that reflected the wider rhythm of life. And in these objects, there was no display, only quiet expression. Clothing in early Persia was designed primarily for the environment. Loose garments, often made from wool or linen, allowed air to move across the body, protecting against both heat during the day and cooler temperatures at night. Long robes, simple tunics, and wrapped fabrics were common, shaped more by comfort and function than by strict style. And as fabric moved with the body, it carried the air, softly and continuously. The colors of these garments varied depending on available materials and dyes. Natural tones, earth, sand, muted reds and browns were common, though brighter colors appeared in certain contexts, especially among those with access to more resources. Yet even then, color was not overwhelming. It remained balanced. Patterns, when present, were often simple and repeated. Geometric forms, lines, and subtle motifs appeared in woven textiles, reflecting a quiet sense of order rather than complexity. And in these patterns there was rhythm, not decoration alone, but structure. The process of making cloth was slow and continuous. Wool was cleaned, spun into thread, and woven on simple looms, often within the home or small shared spaces. This work required patience and consistency, carried out over long periods without interruption. And as threads crossed, over and under, something took shape. Gradually. Metalwork also played an important role in daily life. Craftsmen shaped bronze, silver, and gold into tools, vessels, and ornaments, using techniques that had developed over generations. These objects were not produced quickly, but carefully. Each one formed through repeated motion. Drinking vessels, small containers, and decorative items often featured animal forms, curved lines, or symmetrical designs. These shapes reflected both observation of the natural world and a preference for balance within form. And in the surface of polished metal, light moved gently, revealing detail without sharpness. Even the simplest objects carried a sense of completion. A bowl, a cup, a tool. Each was made to fulfill its purpose, but also to exist comfortably within the hand and the space it occupied. There was no excess, no unnecessary detail, only what was needed and well made. Jewelry, when worn, remained subtle. Rings, bracelets, or small adornments were crafted with care, often reflecting status or identity, but without overwhelming the overall appearance. And as these pieces caught the light, they did not shine brightly, but softly and briefly. Art in early Persia was not separate from life. It appeared in objects, in architecture, in textiles, and in small details that were part of everyday experience. There were no clear boundaries between function and beauty. They existed together. In places like Persepolis, this approach could be seen more clearly. Reliefs carved into stone showed figures in ordered procession, their clothing detailed, their movements calm, their expressions composed. These images did not seek to impress, but to represent a sense of stability and continuity. And even in smaller settlements, the same approach appeared in quieter forms, in objects used each day. The act of creating was not separate from the rhythm of life. It followed the same patterns, steady, repetitive, and attentive. There was no urgency to finish quickly, no pressure to produce beyond what was needed. And within that pace, quality emerged, naturally. Hands moved again and again, shaping, adjusting, refining. And over time, these movements became familiar, almost without thought. Children observed these processes as part of daily life. They watched how materials were handled, how patterns were formed, and how attention was given to even the smallest details. And in that observation, skills were learned, quietly and completely. The environment continued to influence every aspect of this creation. Heat, light, and available resources all shaped what could be made and how it would be used. Nothing existed outside of these conditions. Everything responded to the same world, and perhaps that is what gave these objects their sense of balance. They were not created in isolation, but within a larger rhythm, shared by all. As the day moved toward evening and light softened across surfaces, these objects remained unchanged, yet present. Clothing rested, tools were set aside, and crafted items returned to stillness, waiting for the next day to begin again. And in that quiet pause, the work of many hands remained, part of the world, without needing to be seen. And as the land became more connected, as roads stretched further and cities grew more defined, something else began to take form. Across the vast Persian Empire, especially during the reign of Darius I in the late 6th century BCE, the need for structure extended beyond roads and trade. A system of governance began to emerge, one that could hold together distant regions without forcing them into sameness. And across this wide expanse, order did not arrive suddenly. It settled, slowly, into place. The empire was divided into regions known as satrapies. Each satrapy functioned as a governed territory, overseen by an appointed official called a satrap, who acted on behalf of the king. These regions varied in size and culture, reflecting the diversity of the empire itself. And within each one, life continued, not replaced, but guided. The role of the satrap was not to change local customs, but to maintain stability. They were responsible for collecting taxes, overseeing security, and ensuring that the king's authority was recognized across their region. Yet even within this responsibility, there was flexibility, a quiet allowance for difference. Local traditions, languages, and beliefs were often preserved. People were not required to abandon their ways of life, but to exist within a broader system that connected them to the empire as a whole. And in that structure, diversity remained, without conflict. To prevent imbalance or misuse of power, another layer of oversight existed beyond the satraps themselves. Messengers and officials, sometimes described as the eyes and ears of the king, traveled across the empire, observing conditions and reporting directly back to the central authority. And along the roads, they moved quietly, carrying not goods, but awareness. These individuals did not announce themselves openly. Their presence was subtle, their purpose clear: to ensure that no single region drifted too far from the structure that held the empire together. And in that quiet observation, control was maintained without visible force. The king, often referred to as the King of Kings, stood at the center of this system. This title did not erase the authority of local leaders, but placed them within a hierarchy that extended across the entire empire. And from that center, in places like Susa or Persepolis, decisions moved outward, slowly, but steadily. Communication, supported by the royal road and relay systems, allowed this structure to function across great distances. Messages traveled, reports returned, and information flowed in both directions, linking the center to the edges. And through that movement, the empire remained connected and aware. Taxes, collected in various forms depending on the region, supported the functioning of this system. They were not uniform, but adjusted according to local conditions. Some paid in goods, others in resources or labor. And in this exchange, there was no single form, only a shared contribution to the whole. Law within the empire was not entirely centralized. Local systems of justice often remained in place, guided by traditions that had existed long before Persian rule. The imperial system did not replace these entirely. It rested above them, providing a wider frame. And in that layered structure, order existed without removing what came before. For those living within smaller settlements, and the presence of this system was often distant. It appeared occasionally, in the arrival of officials, in the collection of taxes, or in the passing of messages along the road. But daily life remained, largely unchanged, guided more by land than by law. And yet, there was a quiet awareness that something larger existed beyond the horizon. A system that connected distant places, that moved unseen, but shaped the conditions of life. The strength of this governance did not come from constant enforcement, but from balance. Too much control would disrupt the natural rhythms of life, while too little would allow fragmentation. So, the system remained measured, adjusted over time. And perhaps that is why it endured as long as it did. Because it did not attempt to reshape everything. It allowed much of it to remain. As the sun moved across the land, touching fields, roads, and distant cities, this structure held quietly and continuously, not visible in every moment, but present in the background of all things. And within that presence, the empire remained, not as a force, but as a framework, supporting what had always been there. And beyond the cities, beyond the roads, there was another presence, one that moved across the land. As the Persian Empire expanded under rulers such as Cyrus and later Darius I, maintaining stability across such a vast territory required more than governance alone. A structured military force became essential, not only for defense, but for presence, for movement, and for maintaining the balance that held the empire together. And across the open plains, units began to move, steady and organized. The Persian army was not a single uniform force, but a gathering of many groups drawn from different regions of the empire. Each brought its own style of clothing, weapons, and methods of fighting, reflecting the diversity that defined the empire itself. And within that diversity, there was still order held together by structure. Infantry, archers, and cavalry all played roles within this system. Archers, in particular, were central to Persian warfare, using composite bows that allowed for both range and precision. Cavalry units added mobility, moving quickly across terrain that might slow others. And across the land, their movement remained fluid and controlled. Training emphasized discipline rather than aggression. Soldiers were expected to move in formation, to respond to signals, and to maintain cohesion within the group. This was not a force driven by chaos, but by coordination and repeated practice. Among these forces, one group stood apart, the Immortals. This elite unit, maintained at a constant number of 10,000 soldiers, served as both royal guard and core military force. Their name came not from an inability to fall, but from a system of replacement that kept their number unchanged. If one soldier was lost, another stepped forward, and the formation remained complete. This continuity gave the impression of permanence. To those observing from a distance, the Immortals appeared constant, unbroken, and enduring, regardless of what occurred in battle. And in that perception, there was strength, not only physical, but symbolic. Their appearance reflected both function and identity. They carried spears, short swords, and bows, and wore garments that allowed movement while offering protection. Their equipment was not excessive, but balanced, suited to the rhythm of their movement. And when they stood together, in ordered lines, their presence was quiet, but unmistakable. The military did not exist only in moments of conflict. Much of its role involved movement across the empire, escorting officials, protecting roads, and maintaining a visible presence along important paths such as the Royal Road. And along these routes, they appeared, then passed, without disturbance. Encampments formed temporarily as units moved. Simple arrangements, tents, fires, and organized spaces allowed soldiers to rest and prepare before continuing their journey. These camps were not permanent. They existed, only as long as needed. And as night settled, under open sky, the sound of movement faded into stillness. Even within the structure of the military, daily life retained a familiar rhythm. Meals were shared, equipment maintained, and moments of rest taken when possible. There was no constant tension, only readiness, held quietly. The presence of the army, while essential, did not dominate the lives of most people. It passed through regions, appeared when needed, and remained part of the wider system rather than an overwhelming force within daily life. And for many, it was something seen only occasionally, at a distance, yet its role remained significant. It provided the stability that allowed roads to function, trade to continue, and governance to extend across distance. And in that role, it became part of the structure, supporting without overwhelming. The idea of strength within the Persian military was not expressed through constant conflict, but through continuity, through the ability to remain, to move, to respond when needed. And perhaps that is why the image of the Immortals endured, not as individuals, but as a presence that did not seem to disappear, even as time passed, as rulers changed, and as the empire shifted. Their form remained steady, unchanged in number, and across the land, as wind moved over plains, and light shifted across distant ground. The army continued, not loudly, but persistently, a movement within the larger rhythm of ancient Persia itself. And while the land remained calm and life followed its steady rhythm, there were places where that rhythm changed. Within the inner spaces of the Persian court, especially under rulers such as Cambyses II and Darius I, life followed a different pattern, one shaped not by land or seasons but by proximity to power. These were not open spaces like fields or roads, but enclosed environments where decisions carried weight far beyond their walls. And within these spaces, movement remained controlled, measured, and observed. The court was not always a place of ease. Though it held wealth, structure, and ceremony, it also carried tension, subtle, often unspoken, but always present beneath the surface. Positions were held carefully, relationships maintained with awareness, and actions considered with caution. And in the quiet of these halls, words carried further than they seemed. The structure of authority was clear, yet not always stable. Even among those closest to the king, trust could shift, and influence could change over time. What appeared secure could become uncertain, without warning. In such an environment, maintaining order required more than governance. It required control, applied not constantly, but when necessary, and often with visible consequence. And in those moments, the calm of the court could shift slightly. Punishments, when carried out, were intended not only to respond to actions, but to reinforce a structure. They were not frequent in everyday life, but within the court, they served as reminders of the boundaries that defined power. And though they were rarely seen by many, their presence was known, quietly but clearly. Some forms of punishment were severe, reflecting the seriousness with which loyalty and order were regarded. Historical accounts, particularly from Greek observers such as Herodotus, describe methods that emphasized both control and consequence. Yet, even in these descriptions, there is distance between event and memory. These actions were not part of daily life for most people. They existed within a specific layer of the empire, closer to its center, further from the rhythms of ordinary existence. And beyond those walls, life continued, unchanged. For those within the court, awareness of consequence shaped behavior. Decisions were made carefully, words chosen with attention, and actions measured against their potential outcomes. There was no need for constant enforcement, only the knowledge that it could occur, and in that knowledge, order was maintained, without constant interruption. The palace itself reflected this dual nature. Its architecture was open yet defined, its spaces large yet structured, allowing both movement and observation. Columns rose, halls extended, and courtyards opened to the sky, creating an environment that felt both expansive and contained. And within that space, light moved freely, but attention remained focused. Ceremonial life within the palace continued alongside this structure. Delegations arrived, offerings were presented, and rituals were carried out with precision and calm. These moments reflected the order of the empire, not its tension, but its stability. And yet, beneath that surface, there remained a quiet awareness that power required balance, and that balance was not always gentle. For most people across the empire, these inner dynamics remained distant, almost abstract. They might hear fragments, stories carried by travelers, mentions of events that occurred far away, but these did not shape their daily routines. And in their lives, the land remained the same. Fields were still tended, water still flowed, and the rhythm of day and night continued, without interruption. Perhaps that distance is what allowed both realities to exist at once. A vast empire, with its center of power and control, and a wide landscape where life remained steady and calm. And between these two, there was space, enough for both to continue. As the sun lowered across the horizon, touching palace wall and distant fields alike, light softened without distinction, and in that shared light, power and ordinary life became, briefly, the same. Before night returned, and everything, once again, grew still. And as the day began to soften, the land slowly changed again, not in form, but in feeling. Across the Persian world, as the sun moved toward the horizon, daily activity began to ease. The intensity of heat faded, and the sharp brightness of midday light gave way to a warmer, more muted glow. This transition did not happen suddenly. It unfolded gradually, almost unnoticed, as shadows lengthened across the ground. and in that shifting light, the air began to cool, just enough to be felt. In villages and small settlements, people started to return from the fields, from paths, and from distant tasks that had carried them through the day. Tools were set aside, animals guided back, and movement slowed into something more contained. And across the land, footsteps softened, blending into the quiet of evening. The sky changed color as the sun lowered, moving from pale brightness into tones of gold, then deeper shades of red and soft violet. These colors did not remain fixed. They shifted continuously, reflecting across stone, dust, and the surfaces of water. And as the light moved, the world seemed to slow with it. Within homes, small preparations began. Fires were lit again, not for work this time, but for warmth, for food, and for the comfort of shared space. The glow of firelight replaced the fading sunlight, creating a softer, more enclosed atmosphere. And inside these walls, light no longer spread outward. It gathered gently. Meals in the evening remained simple, much like those earlier in the day. Bread, fruit, and whatever had been prepared or saved were shared among family members, often without formal structure or ceremony. Eating was not rushed. It followed the same pace as everything else. Conversations during this time were quiet. Voices remained low, carried gently through the air, shaped more by presence than by the need to speak. There was no urgency to fill silence. It was allowed to remain. Children, who had moved through the day in observation and small participation, now settled closer to their families. They listened, watched, and rested, absorbing the rhythm of evening without needing explanation. And in that closeness, there was comfort, simple and steady. Outside, the land began to release the heat it had held throughout the day. The air cooled gradually, and a faint movement returned. Soft winds passing across open ground, carrying with them a sense of relief. And in that air, the day seemed to fade, without resistance. In some places, particularly near gathering spaces or along travel routes, stories began to be shared. These were not formal performances, but quiet retellings. Memories, observations, or fragments carried from other places. As stories of distant lands, of rulers, of journeys, beyond the horizon. And as these stories moved from voice to voice, they changed slightly, becoming part of something shared. The sky, now deepening into night, revealed the first stars. Without artificial light to obscure them, they appeared clearly, scattered across the vast darkness above. And as more stars emerged, the sky itself became a presence. For those who traveled, these stars offered guidance. For those who remained, they offered something else, a sense of scale, of distance, and of continuity beyond the limits of the day. And under that sky, thoughts moved quietly, without direction. The transition into night was not marked by a clear boundary. It unfolded slowly, as light disappeared and darkness settled into the spaces it left behind. And within that darkness, there was no fear, only stillness. Homes grew quieter. Movement slowed further. Conversations ended naturally, and individuals prepared for rest. There was no defined hour to sleep, only a gradual letting go of the day. And as bodies settled and breath slowed, the rhythm of life shifted once more. Outside, the land remained unchanged. Mountains stood in shadow. The ground held the memory of heat, and the air moved gently across it all. And under the night sky, everything remained. Not active, not silent, but simply present. Perhaps this was the truest rhythm of life in ancient Persia. Not the moments of movement or activity, but the quiet transitions between them, the soft return from day to night, and in that return, Nothing was lost, only carried forward into the stillness of another night. And as the last traces of light disappeared, night did not arrive suddenly. It settled softly across the land. Across the Persian plateau, once the sun had fully set, the sky opened into a vast field of darkness, unbroken by artificial light. Stars appeared gradually, at first only a few, then many, until the entire sky seemed filled with quiet points of brightness. And above the still land, the night stretched outward. Without boundary, the air cooled further, carrying away the heat of the day in slow, gentle movement. This change was not sharp, but steady, felt across the skin and in the way the body began to relax. And in that cooling air, breath slowed, becoming softer and more even. For those resting outside or near open spaces, the night sky became something to observe, not actively, but passively, something present above, requiring no effort to understand. Patterns of stars were recognized over time, not through formal learning, but through repeated viewing across many nights. And in those patterns, there was familiarity, quiet and constant. The land itself remained visible in fragments, outlines of hills, the faint shapes of structures, and the gentle contrast between sky and ground. Nothing was fully illuminated, but nothing was entirely hidden, and within that balance there was comfort in not seeing everything at once. Sounds during the night were minimal. A distant movement, the soft shifting of air, or the occasional call of an animal might pass through the stillness, but never enough to disturb it. And in that quiet, each sound carried, then faded, without trace. Inside homes, rest deepened. The warmth of the day remained lightly within the walls, while the outside air cooled further, creating a gentle contrast between interior and exterior space. Bodies settled into stillness, following the natural rhythm that had guided the entire day. And within that stillness, there was no effort, only rest. For travelers, the night held a different quality. It was both a time of pause and, in some cases, of movement, guided by the stars that offered direction across open land. Journeys continued carefully, step by step, shaped by the same awareness that defined all movement in this world. And under the wide sky, paths became less visible, but still present. Thoughts during this time often moved more freely. Without the demands of work or movement, the mind followed its own quiet rhythm, drifting between memory, observation, and simple awareness. There was no need to resolve these thoughts, no need to hold them. They passed as gently as the air. Perhaps this was when the scale of the world was felt most clearly. Under the vastness of the night sky, individual life seemed small, yet not insignificant, part of something larger, something continuous. And in that awareness, there was no tension, only presence. The beliefs held by many, shaped by ideas of light and darkness, found quiet reflection here. The contrast between day and night, between brightness and shadow, was not only observed but experienced directly. And in that experience, understanding deepened, without words. Time during the night did not feel measured. There were no clear markers, no divisions, only the gradual movement from one state of rest to another. And within that flow, there was no beginning, no end. The land, though resting, remained unchanged. Mountains stood as they had during the day. The ground held its form, and the air continued its slow movement across open space. Nothing was paused, only quieted for a time. And as the night continued, the stars remained steady, unmoving to the eye, yet part of a motion too vast to see. Perhaps those who looked upward felt this, not as knowledge, but as a quiet sense of continuity, that everything moved, even in stillness, and that stillness itself was not empty, but full of what could not be seen, yet always remained. As hours passed without being counted, rest deepened, and the world remained undisturbed, until slowly, without announcement, the cycle would begin again, with the return of light. And as the night continues, nothing asks for your attention. Nothing needs to be held. Across the land of ancient Persia, the same quiet rhythm remains, unchanged, unhurried, and undisturbed by the passing of time. The mountains still rest beneath the sky, the air still moves gently across the ground, and the memory of the day lingers softly within the land. And in that stillness, everything continues without effort. There is no need to follow every detail, no need to remember every place or every moment that has passed, because the rhythm of this world does not depend on being held, only on being felt. You have moved through the early morning, through light touching the land, through the quiet work of the day, through the steady flow of water beneath the earth. You have followed the paths between places, stood within spaces of gathering, and rested beneath the open sky. And now there is nothing more to do, only to remain within this calm. The air is cool, the land is still, and the sky stretches endlessly above. There are no sharp edges here, no sudden movement, only the gentle continuation of everything you have heard. And as you rest, the world of ancient Persia does not disappear. It remains quietly waiting. Waiting in the soft light of morning, waiting in the warmth of the afternoon, waiting in the stillness of night. You can return to it at any moment, not by effort, but by simply allowing it. And if your thoughts begin to drift, that is all right. They can move as slowly as the wind across the plateau. They can settle like light, resting on stone and earth. There is nothing to hold on to and nothing to follow, only the quiet presence of a world that continues, without asking anything from you. And as you rest here, you may begin to feel that the beginning is not far away. The first light returning softly over distant hills. The same land, awakening again, without urgency. And if you wish, you may begin again from the beginning, letting the story unfold once more, slowly. And for now, you can simply remain here, within the stillness, within the quiet, within the rhythm that never truly ends.